Well, hey, everybody, we're all here gathered to enjoy another great round of effective small group discussion conversation. And I am happy and pleased and honored to have Alan White with us this afternoon. Alan wrote the book. Let's see if I can get it in here and my magical thing. Yeah, there you go. Exponential Groups. Exponential Groups. And that's what we're talking about this week, Alan. The topic of the week has been dealing with how do we create these relational connections. And I'm curious, and I'd like you just briefly to unpack your book for us on exponential groups. What does that mean? What is an exponential group? Just unpack it for us and teach us a little bit from your book.
Okay, so I go a different angle on exponential than a lot of people do. Because if you talk to the guys at Exponential, what they'll say is exponential is that you start with a group, and out of that group, groups are birthed, and out of those groups, groups are birthed, and you have generations of groups, and that's the idea of exponential multiplication. And that's kind of the idea that I started with Carl George's book from the early 90s called Prepare Your Church for the Future. He brought over some ideas that he had taken from Cho's church in Korea. And so I set out to create that in our church in California. And we did that for 7 years. I felt like I was banging my head against a wall. And so 1 year we'd start 10 groups, and 1 year we started 2 groups, and 1 year we didn't start any. And over 7 years, I had one leader that developed an apprentice and who actually started a group. And so I got a little frustrated with it. Now, the funny thing is Carl George has become a friend of mine. He lives on the other side of Greenville, South Carolina from me. So we get together once in a while. So I was complaining to Carl one day. I said, this apprentice model doesn't work in our church, Carl. And he said, well, the apprentice model works well in educated congregations. And I muttered under my breath, the apprentice model works well in Korea. But anyway, so that's one idea of exponential. I went the other way, and it came out of a conversation that Brett Eastman shared with me. It was a conversation between Rick Warren and Bruce Wilkinson. And the idea was that exponential in the sense of adding an exponent to your goal. So I think at Saddleback at the time, they had a goal of 100 new groups. And they said, well, why don't you add a 0 on that and start 1,000 new groups? And so this idea of the subtitle of my book is Unleashing Your Church's Potential. And so the thought was, instead of doing all of this hand-to-mouth, recruiting individual leaders, training them, launching them, all of this, why not just go the other direction and open this wide up and let anybody lead and let them gather their friends and make it exponential in that sense. So that I took a little different direction. Some people will take exception to that of what is exponential. The bottom line is, over 7 years, we got to 30% of our adults in groups, our average adult attendance, over 7 years of apprentice model and trying to go that way. On the day that my pastor announced that we had developed a series and that anybody could open up their home and have a group, we doubled our groups in a day. Wow. And within 6 months, we doubled again. So we were at a place where we had 125% of our adult attendance in groups. And I thought that was a really big deal. But the bigger deal was this, that over an 18-month period, we'd gone from having 30% of our adults in groups to having nearly 40% of our groups, or 40% of our people lead a group. Wow. For at least one study. And when it all shook out, and this is the number that's important, when it all shook out, we had 13% of our adults that were leading small groups. And what I discovered was initially the big goal was, let's get everybody connected into groups. But the real goal ended up being, how many people can I enlist in leading groups? And then, of course, it took some redefining what a leader was and that sort of thing. So in a nutshell, now, when I look at exponential groups, I see it as a system. So it's the way the way that you recruit leaders, the way that you connect people into groups, which kind of goes back to some things Joseph Meyer just talked to you about, how you coach and support leaders, how you train them. And we've used, church-wide campaigns or alignment series where the small group curriculum goes along with the sermon. And to me, the point of that is not even getting everybody to study the same thing for the sake of everybody studying the same thing. The point of that is it's an excuse to have the start of a leadership recruiting process. And of course, the way that it works is you have your senior pastor recruiting leaders rather than having the small group guy doing it. So that's a nutshell. We can unpack all of that.
You kind of sparked another question for me, because
okay.
You do a lot of work and have a lot. You're a consultant with churches all over the country,
yep.
and you also have been around a long time. So you're kind of the perfect person to ask this question to.
Okay.
But I'm kind of a numbers guy, and this has been somewhat observational, somewhat anecdotal, somewhat there is some hard research at times that emerges. But in the average congregation, what is the percentage of people who are involved in a small group, beyond, I'm talking beyond the Sunday morning or, the weekend worship service, the big gathering? What's the percentage of those on an average in the American church that go into a small group the rest of the week? You got any idea?
Yeah, I don't have data. You could go to probably Robert Wuthnow, or Ed Stetzer did transformational groups a couple of years ago with Eric Geiger. But here's anecdotal. I've worked with over 1,500 churches in the last 16 years. In various, some were in a class, some were in, so I'll count you guys, and so I'll say 1,510. But anyway, here's what I see. With a reasonable amount of effort, most churches can connect 30% of their adults into groups. So it's kind of a low-hanging fruit. If you look at Everett Rogers' work in the diffusion of innovation, which is research that goes back to the 1940s, it's the bell curve. So 30% are your innovators and your early adopters. Very easy to get those. If you persist and you work a little harder and pull out more of the stops, you can get to about 50 to 60% of your adults connected into groups. There's not a lot of people that get there, but some do. And then you have to do some different things to get to the last 30 to 40% of your church. Now, here's the other side of it. If you have 30% of your average attendance connected into groups, you are in the top 0.5% of all churches in the United States.
Yeah.
And and again, it's just having a moderate amount of effort. You can apply more effort maybe to get to half, but then after that, you've got to do some different things to get the rest of them, because there's not one small group strategy that's going to connect 100% of your people into groups. But there's no rule that says you can't use more than one strategy. So,
yeah. Well, in fact, that's part of our conversation this week. And, we're our lecturer, our video lecturer from Lisa Tony, who developed this class. She was talking about relational connections this week. And and maybe we ought to ask you this question, as far as what are some of the factors that cause people to resist getting connected to a small group? What, do you have a list, or do you have some thoughts on that, as far as what are those factors that keep people really, they resist it?
Yeah, well, I mean, the easy one is I don't have time, I'm too busy. Right. And so about a month ago, I wrote a blog post that said suddenly everybody has time for a group because everybody's stuck at home. But then they started complaining about Zoom fatigue, and I was like, is this a new excuse to replace I don't have time? I think the main thing is if people don't understand the benefit, and the other part of it to me is people are going to follow wherever your senior pastor leads them. If your senior pastor's been there for any length of time. So if your senior pastor hates small groups, you're going to have you're going to get up to 30%, and I'm going to pat you on the back and say, congratulations. But don't be frustrated, because that's kind of where you're going to live. But and part of it is senior pastors don't want to be in groups themselves, which that's kind of awkward anyway. And the truth be told, if my senior pastor had a small group, I wouldn't want to be in the small group that's attracted to the senior pastor. But that's a whole other thing. I'm a little, ironic in some ways. But other reasons, people talk about childcare, they talk about schedules, they talk about this, that, and the other. They don't know anybody. They're introverted. They don't want to hang out with strangers. They don't like the groups that the church has. There's all kinds of classic reasons for all of that. And so my way of doing this, and this is where Joseph Myers influenced my thinking. I hated his book, but the end of my review of his book was, thank you for writing a book that I love to hate. But the idea of people are not friendless for the most part. Now, we can go to the exceptions, but let's not go to the exceptions immediately. Let's just allow the exceptions to be the exceptions. People that are new to the community, people that are new to the church, people who found your online service during the pandemic. They don't know anybody. That's the exception. But for the most part, people have friends, they have neighbors, they have coworkers, they have personal relationships, as Joseph would say. I borrowed an analogy. I should have kept it up here. I just used it on a video the other day. But I borrowed an analogy from this guy, Leith Anderson, in his book, A Church for the 21st Century, that he wrote about 25 years ago. And he talks about how people are like Legos. And my house, I have 4 children. I have 3 sons. So our house, we have thousands of Legos. And so if you take a Lego has a dot. They have dots on it where they connected the other Legos. And so the idea is, if people are like Legos, and you can think about this for yourself, is that if you have a Lego, let's just say with 8 dots on it, which some of you may have a Lego with 2 dots on it. Some of you may have a Lego with 48 dots on it. But if you take that Lego right off the bat, who would you say are your personal relationships? Who would be in those 8 spots, your top 8 on that Lego? And so I'll ask it rhetorically. So your spouse would be in there, maybe a couple of friends, maybe neighbors, coworkers, maybe the coach of your kids' sports team, maybe somebody that you serve with at church, which could be coworkers in our case. And so if you think about that Lego that has 8 on there and they're all snapped up, if I tell that person, you need to join a small group, what am I asking them to do? I'm asking them to spend time with people that they don't know very well, that they may or may not like, and forsake spending time with the people who are already in their lives and already connected with them. So we'll get back to the Lego in a second. So one year, I wanted to prove to our church that small groups were the best thing since sliced bread and were the fast track to spiritual growth. So I had him in the last Sunday of the year. That's when the associate pastor preaches. And I've always been an associate. I've never been a senior. So I preached the last Sunday of the year. We handed out a paper, back in the day, paper health assessment, and gave it to everyone who came in and said, please fill out this health assessment during the service. We're going to collect it in the end. So maybe during a boring part of the sermon, go ahead and fill it out, because I was preaching. And lo and behold, nobody had a problem getting it done. And they turned it in. And on the form, in addition to the health assessment, we asked them whether or not they were in a small group. So we took the paper forms and we made a stack of the saints who were in small groups and a stack of the sinners who were not in small groups. And we were going to tally up these scores and prove that if you were in a small group, you were nailing it on this health assessment. And if you weren't, this is your problem. You need to be in a small group. And so this was a purpose-driven health assessment. So the purpose is from Saddleback: fellowship, discipleship, ministry, worship, and evangelism. So we took the results from the people in groups and we calculated them, and they rated themselves highest in fellowship, and then worship, and then discipleship, ministry, and evangelism. And we said, all right, let's see what the losers chose. So we got out the ones that were not connected into groups, and we added up their scores, and the people not in groups rated themselves highest in fellowship, worship, discipleship, ministry, and evangelism. It was exactly the same. So then I thought, well, they must not have understood what I meant. I was beside myself. How could they think they could be highest in fellowship? They're not even in a small group. They don't even know what fellowship is. And so I sent them another survey. And I said, do you love Jesus? Do you want to go to heaven? What's your problem? No, I didn't say that. I said, what other believers are you connected to on a regular basis? And what they came back with were friends, family, coworkers, neighbors, customers, people that they served with. And all of a sudden it dawned on me. I don't have a segment of people that are in community and a segment of people that are not in community. That everybody is in community with somebody already. And all I had to do was to draw a circle around them, give them something that, a curriculum that they could use to intentionally grow spiritually, and just leverage the groups that we already had. And that's why the first line of Exponential Groups is everybody's already in the group. Now, there are people that are new to your community. There are people that are new to your church that may not know anybody. And there are some ways you could help them get connected into groups. But we found we could get more people engaged with leading a group if they could choose the group that they led. Instead of, getting a sign-up card or go to the web page or look at the small group directory and choose a group, and you fill out a thing or you sign up and you hope somebody gets back to you, and then you get connected into a group of people you don't even know. My analogy for that is it's like we're setting our people up on blind dates. Who would you rather be in a group with? A group of, we're pastors, we're not normal. I say that in the loveliest sense of the word. But we're not, our relationship with the church is not the normal experience of people. But if you could choose a group to walk into, would you rather be in a group of your friends rather than a group of people that you don't know? And so we found that with extroverts, they could open up their home and they could meet never met a stranger. But with introverts, they would never do that. They would never open up their home to strangers, but they had 4 or 5 really good friends that they would do a Bible study with. And then the people that had weird job schedules, and the people that had special needs children, and the people that, couldn't figure out the time to have a group, and the people that didn't like any of the groups that we had, they could all start their own group on their own terms. And we just saw an amazing number of people. And the crazy thing is, the church that I learned this at, our results were small. I have churches of 2,500 with 5,000 people in groups. I had a church of 600 in Baltimore that started with 7 groups, and we did a series and opened this up. They ended up with 167 groups in a church of 600 adults. So anyway, I've talked a lot, and I see the questions are chiming in.
Well, we are getting some questions that are starting to pop, and that's good stuff here. But let me kind of summarize what I think I hear you saying. And you could take 2 cats and tie their tails together and get some unity. You won't get community. And what we're looking for is community, not just unity, right?
I like that.
Yeah. All right. Well, Kurt, you kind of talking a little bit, mentioned on the chat function, and JP as well, about this, getting the senior pastor. Why don't you share your concern, or maybe put it into a question or a thought?
Yeah, sure. So my thought on small groups, we've been here about 3.5 years now. And we've been a part of probably 2 or 3 different small groups. We have somewhere between 7 and 10 groups right now running.
Okay.
We've got what I would call about 3 of them are healthy. We've got a few that have been existing for a long time that aren't super healthy, but they've been existing for a long time, and that's their group. And I've talked with Dr. Chromey and the class about this throughout the course of this semester. But the question I had is as a lead pastor, and especially one coming to the church this is a smaller church, has a small church culture where it's very guarded. You know, we're still to some degree looked at as outsiders, even though we've been here for 3.5 years.
Yeah.
And one of the things we found, kind of like you talked about with senior pastors, is it is awkward for us in small groups. It kind of goes one of two ways. It's either everybody wants to be in this group or nobody wants to be in this group. And often the ones that want to be in this group, we're like, I don't really want you to know where my house is. I don't want you to have my cell phone. You know, like, because you're the kind, I think, that would take advantage of that. And so it's been difficult and it's been awkward. Yeah. And what I put in the chat was, at times I feel hypocritical because by and large, we haven't been in a group. We've been in groups, like kind of almost transition type groups. You know, we're in one right now that's we've been wanting to kind of get going for a while anyway. This class gave us an excuse to actually get it started. But right now the group is comprised of people who are new to our church who came because my wife invited them. And so she works with the two ladies.
Yeah.
But by and large, what we found is, and this is what I mentioned in the chat, sometimes I feel hypocritical getting on stage and pushing our groups and, you know, making that one of our core values and saying you need to be in community when we're not.
Yeah.
And, you know, we can throw every excuse out there. We have 3 small kids. We're extremely busy. My wife's work schedule is busy. We have all the built-in excuses that everybody has.
Yep.
But that was just my thing. Is that more common than I realize, that senior pastors will push these and encourage people and say, you need to be in a small group, when sometimes we aren't? I mean, I just want to make sure I'm not the only one who's living this.
First of all, I think you're probably going to get an F in this course.
Okay.
No, but you bring up several.
Honestly, I just need a C. This is my last class, so as long as I get a C, I'm good.
Well, I can avoid that.
That's awesome. That's awesome. No, so here, I mean, so seriously, Kurt, you bring up several interesting issues. One is, if you're pastoring a smaller church, when you introduce something new, you have to bet on a winner. Because if, like, the last church I served was 6,500 in the weekend. And so if we did something that ended up, you know, alienating 10 groups of people that were give or take 100 people, and we lost 100 people, I don't know that we would have noticed.
Right.
But if you're in a smaller church and you lose 100 people, I mean, you're screwed. And so you really have to bet on a sure thing. You have to make sure it's the right thing. And part of it is not just a matter of, oh, I listened to some expert and he says it's the right thing, but also what's the right thing for your culture and for your people. And so that's something you have to figure out. The other thing about smaller churches is, and you already did it, you said groups, because smaller churches resent the term small group because they are a small group. So you just say group and just kind of go that way. But I think the bigger question that you were asking is very common with senior pastors is either they don't want to be in a group, or they're afraid of, are people going to be confidential? Am I going to trust people? Can I be myself in the group? And so what I encourage senior pastors is, find something that you can call your group. And if it's a Skype call that you do once or twice a month with other pastors you went to school with, just to talk about being a pastor, then that can be your group. If you're going to do a group in the church, I think it's interesting the way you did it, because what I actually tell people is, if you want to do a group that has members of your church involved, then create whatever group that your wife is comfortable with. Let her pick the group. So, which is kind of what you're doing.
Yeah.
But the other way to go would be to do groups that are intentionally, like Carl George would call it, a turbo group, where you would invite people into a group for a season, but the purpose of the group is to train them to lead groups. So they're not going to be with you forever, but it is kind of that balance. So wherever you can find a place to experience community yourself, and I joke with some pastors, I'm like, do you play golf? Yeah. Do you play with the same guys regularly? Yeah. I said, well, your foursome is your small group. So now go and tell your people to get groups, you know, but I think does that make sense at all?
Yeah, no, it does. And you know, you mentioned introducing, the groups have been here. They've had groups for quite a while. The problem is the groups are incredibly kind of closed off. And actually, before I got here, the previous lead pastor, he led a small group, and that group was like 30, 40 people. And when anybody would make the mention of, we need to potentially, sorry, my kids are sprinting through the house yelling.
That's all right. I've got 4 kids in my house, and I think my
wife
used duct tape on their mouths or
I
something.
thought you had a demon in the dog or something.
The dogs, well, I sort of say the dog's the calm one, and he just comes flying through here. So
that's all right.
If you can't hear me, I apologize.
Let me pop in here, Kurt, and maybe this will give you a little bit of help. And Alan, I don't know if you've thought of this idea or not. My pastor at my church several years ago, and he doesn't do it anymore. I wish he would. In fact, it kind of fell apart after a while. We had some changes. But what he used to do that I thought was really cool was at 1 o'clock on Mondays. At 1 o'clock on Mondays, he would have what he called sermon study. And he invited down to the church, guys like myself who had advanced degrees in theology. And, you know, we have a local Bible college. So he had a couple of those guys coming out, and he had a few of his interns that were in there, preaching interns that were in there. But basically it was a high level Bible study on the passage he was going to be preaching the next week. And we just went into it, and it was probably the best Bible study I've ever been part of. Because most small groups that I go to that claim to be Bible studies are fairly shallow for a theological guy that's been, you know, but if you've been trained, if you have an MDiv, you know what I'm talking about, and Alan has that. You know, it's a different beast. You know, you're just thinking a different way, and you struggle a lot of times. You like to have those cultural and historical nuances. That's what we did. And Kurt, you know, that's what I would recommend. JP, you guys are leading churches. I'd recommend you gather a group of guys around you from your congregation that they know the Word of God, and let them tear apart your sermon before you ever preach it. You know, just hash it open. You know,
I like that.
Yeah. Alan, any comments there? We'll get some other questions and comments.
Yeah, I would say, you know, going the other way, Kurt, with his question, it really speaks to what a lot of people face, and that is, if you just open it up for anybody to join, then, you know, it is kind of that discomfort. However, there's no problem with just handpicking your own group and you know, asking people to join you. I worked with this pastor this last year. It's a Lutheran church in Barrington, Illinois. And what he started doing was he chose 8 guys, and they used the Discovery Bible Study method, which is the same 9 questions of any passage, started going through, and you can Google that, and you started going through the Sermon on the Mount, and they would go, you know, pericope by pericope, and have a discussion about Jesus's teaching. And he partnered with them for a year, and the idea was after the end of the year that the 8 would go out and find their own group of 8. But he invited them into that, and he came back and told me, he said, this is the best thing I've done in a long time. And he'd been a pastor for 20, 25 years. And so, you know, there's precedent for that. Jesus chose his 12. So, and a lot of, you know, when you get into discipleship groups, you know, Robbie Gallaty, Mike Breen, people like that, they're very much, you know, you invite people into the relationship. So there's really no problem with that. But again, as a senior pastor, to find something that would be your community. And so we've given you several options. So that way you can genuinely say, you need to get into, you know, you need to get into groups, you need to be a part of one. And occasionally you can, you know, talk about your group as an aside. Oh, the other night in my group, we were talking about, you're not even doing a sermon on groups, but you can just mention that you have a group. So whatever you could find to call a group.
Yeah. Well, I have wondered if it's really even a healthy thing for senior pastors to stand up and just kind of champion small groups as like the only thing. And especially if they're championing them in such a way that it sounds like they're always in one. Because in my own journey, there's just been seasons where I was better off not being in a group.
Yeah.
And it didn't mean I didn't have people in my life, but I was better off not being during that time, being in a small group. The small group was more of a drain, or especially if the senior pastor stands up and says, I lead a group at all times. Alan, what do you think about the emphasis some churches make where maybe it tilts more toward the only way towards spiritual growth or towards spiritual health is this really heavy lean on groups as the way to grow or the only way to grow, versus the challenging their people to consistently take the next step in their journey?
Yeah, well, so this is the interesting thing, because if you look at the Reveal study from Willow, what they came up with was that groups are a helpful vehicle to people during part of their spiritual journey. But as people mature, they become more self-feeders, they become more self-motivated, and they don't need a lot of structure in order to connect with God, in order to, so I mean, they don't even need organized ministries in the church. They're just going to serve their neighbor or, help wherever they feel led to help. Maybe they have a better sense of their own personal calling, and they don't need groups as much, which is kind of a funny thing to say, come from a small group guy. But the thing that I've been getting back to lately is going back to scripture and looking at the mission of the church. So, and this is one of those things I always laugh looking back, being on staff at a church, because we'd go out to the woods for 3 days to have a retreat to figure out what our mission was. Well, every church's mission is exactly the same. And Jesus gave it to us in Matthew 28. It's called the Great Commission. That's our mission. Now you go out in the woods for 3 days and figure out your vision and values. But your mission is the mission. So Jesus told us to go and make disciples of every nation, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you. And there are things that get lost in the shuffle there. And so I'm going to say a few things. I'm not going to defend them. I'm just going to stir it up a little bit. So Jesus told us to go and make disciples. He didn't tell us to go and make converts. He didn't tell us to go start small groups. He didn't tell us to go have large worship services. He didn't tell us to go make money. He told us to go make disciples. And we'll leave it there. And then baptizing them, whatever your tradition you do with baptizing. And then the last line kind of punched me between the eyes a couple years ago as I'm reading along the Great Commission and trying not to, yada, yada, yada. But he says, in teaching them to obey all that I've commanded you. And I thought, I wonder when do they put the word obey in there? So I went back and checked several of the translations of the Bible, and sometimes it says observe. But I thought, man, my Christian education background, we got it all wrong. Because we spent a lot of time teaching people Jesus's commandments, but that's not what Jesus said. Jesus said, teach them to obey. And so how do we create an environment that's going to help people learn to obey? But then also backing up, how do we help our members live in obedience to the Great Commission to go and make disciples? Because I've been in some very large churches. I've been part of Saddleback. The church I was serving here was large. We're currently members at New Spring and here in South Carolina. And it's easy to make followers, but are we making disciples? And I've really gone with the definition of how do you know you have a disciple, where, well, a disciple makes disciples. So I've had to back up from, we need a small group and we need a leader. And because those are loaded terms. And so what do I need? I need a way that I can help disciples make disciples. That's what I need. That's the mission. So when I say that I need a leader to make disciples, or I need a leader to make a small group, I'm putting myself in kind of a catch-22. Because on the one hand, when we look at leadership in the church, we should have very high requirements for leadership. Paul says to Timothy in 1 Timothy 5:22, do not be hasty in the laying on of hands. So in order to designate someone as a leader, they need to prove themselves. They need to show that they're of high moral character. There are all kinds of things before we call them a leader. And then one of the churches I was working with in Connecticut, the small group pastor had a realization. He said, he said, I need small group leaders. He said, we're not recruiting elders here. And so sometimes that leader term gets in our way a little bit. So we go back to, what is our mission? Our mission is to equip and empower disciples to make disciples. So then we've gone to language where we've said, get together with your friends and do the study. So we have that piece of leveraging existing relationships, get together with your friends. And in that statement, we're saying, would you lead a group, without using the words leader or group? And so this has really gone to, can we create groups without calling them a group, and have somebody initiate that without calling them a leader, and in that find a way for disciples to make disciples? And the way we came down to it was that if the pastor's advocating a study or advocating a series or throwing out this idea of get together with your friends and do the study, that they're gathering their friends and we don't advertise the groups. And then we decide, what level of requirements we want them to fulfill in order to do this. And every church is different. Some churches, if you're breathing, if you're willing, will take you. Other churches, you need to be a member. Other churches, you have other requirements. Of course, the more requirements you put on it, the fewer the conversations. But I've gotten away from the idea of lowering the bar, because I think that gives a connotation we don't want to have. I think where we go is we say we're going to delay some of the requirements, with the implication that eventually we'll bring some of those requirements back. But the whole goal of this isn't how many people can I get connected into groups. Because all that's going to do is make us proud and we'll brag about it. And that's the way I was. I'm just being, that's me. And I bragged about it. But the goal is, how do we get our people to engage in discipling other people? And how do we give them the tools that they need? How do we give them the permission and opportunity? And maybe we call that small groups. Maybe we call that, triads or quads. Maybe we call that classes. Maybe we call that, a foursome in golf. Maybe we call that being normal in the church, and we get together to apply the word of God to our lives and to care for each other and build each other up. Maybe we just call that normal, and then we don't have to have small group ministries anymore, because that's just normal. All right. I gave you more than you wanted, Ben, but you gave me a jumping off point, so I just went for it.
I don't know about these guys, but I kind of enjoyed the splash there. So thank you very much, Alan. I don't like to get let the hour get too far in here without asking every one of our guests this question. Where do you see small groups going in the future, especially in light of this new season we're in right now, which is kind of exposed a cyber church, an online church? Is there room for Zoom groups, for example? And what do you think that looks like?
Yeah, I have churches that, one church that I'm working with in North Dakota, and then of course Saddleback Church as well, that their groups have grown by 50% with new online groups that have happened in the last 4 weeks. And it's interesting to me because during the pandemic, things have happened one of two ways. Either churches have hunkered down and they're praying that they're going to get through this and that they'll survive it. Or I see other churches that their online audience is 20 times what their weekend service is. And so then how do we connect with those people? How do we get them into membership? How do we get them into a growth track? How do we get them into a group? How do we help them beyond that? The other thing I'm seeing right now are pastors that are creating more online content than I could possibly even believe. And I think there's a place for content. But I saw somebody in a wise tweet, they said that right now, more than content, people need conversation. And so this is where, if your church is on the smaller side, you have the advantage because you can pick up the phone and in a matter of a few weeks, call and have a personal conversation with every single person in your church. If you're in a larger church, one church that I'm working with, their pastor has tasked the staff with calling 160 people a week. Now, what's realistic, the small group pastor said, was calling about 80 people a week. But it really has changed ministry. But there is a place, I think, for online small groups, which has taken some interesting dimensions. Because one is people can gather people that they know, and here's a study guide. But more important than a study guide right now is a place to process life. Because we are having so much information thrown at us, so much conflicting information. Everything from this is a serious health epidemic that was caused by an accident to this is the Democrats in cahoots with China to make Trump lose the election to, I mean, it runs the gamut. And you guys have, you know, and there's 3 symptoms. No, there's 6 symptoms. No, there's 6 feet apart. Wear a mask. Don't wear a mask. Wear gloves. Wash your hands. Our family's been in the house for 45 days because my oldest son has some underlying health problems that if we were to bring that into our home would not be good. You have states that are locked down. You have states like Georgia that are wide open right now. And so people don't know what to do with all of that. So they take it to Facebook. I don't even like going on Facebook right now. You know, first it was jokes and now it's like gotten into all these debates. But I'm silencing people for 30 days. Hopefully 30 days later, it's going to go to something new. But people need a place to process all of this. And they need hope and they need a sure foundation and they need reminders. So the funny thing about online groups is I was in an online group on CompuServe in 1994. So I'm like the grandfather of online small groups. And in our online small group on CompuServe, which I know for some of you, you're like, Compu what? But it was before AOL even, when they were sending all those discs in the mail every week. But our group on CompuServe, you know, it was a message board and a chat room. It wasn't anything like this. And one of the guys wandered into our group and he ended up coming to Christ as a result of those groups. That group is one of my very good friends. And 26 years later, still going strong. And it was kind of interesting in that dynamic. And we were just on there, you know, playing with the new platform. But I think there is a place for things like that. And even, you know, you consider, I did a blog post on the one another's about 6 weeks ago. And the only one another that we really can't practice right now is greet one another with a holy kiss, because that would be bad. But, you know, you look at other one another's, they are better served by technology, like encourage one another daily. How can I encourage other people that I know daily? Right here. I can send them a text. I can call and leave them a voicemail. And I do that. I say, yeah, I saw a meme on Facebook that somebody said, check in on your extroverted friends. We are not okay. And so I texted a friend of mine the other day. I said, how's my extroverted friend doing stuck at home? And he's like, well, thank goodness for the stimulus money because I have a lot of projects right now to keep me occupied, but I appreciate you checking in. And I think that's the case with a lot of people. So I think we can leverage technology for that.
So you see this as a potential window to a new world for the church to explore.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been in conversations with the pastor. He's at a Southern Baptist church in Columbus, Georgia. So down in South Georgia, it's a legacy church of 400. He's only been there for a couple of years. And that church is what it's going to be and what it always has been. And he's doing it. And he put his service online for the first time. And his weekend attendance is 800 and his regular attendance is 400. And so now he's beginning to ask, how do I disciple these online followers? How do I create groups for them? How do I incorporate them into my church? And what he's seeing is when this all goes back to normal, whatever normal is, that his worship service on the weekend will be just like it's been for 100 years. But his online service, he has the ability to innovate and to reach people and to do something new. And so, I mean, people can look at this as this is something to endure. Or, you know what, if you've never tried an online service, if you've never tried an online group, this is the time to experiment. Because I think there'll be things that'll come out of this season that are going to change how ministry in some quarters is done from this point.
Yeah. I'm actually a bit of a skeptic on all this stuff, especially I'll give you a thought on this for years. And I mean, many, many years now. I've posited the idea, and I think it's starting to bear truth, that people are starting to see it. It is true that, you know, a lot of times you heard, you know, traditionally that it was Christmas and Easter. Those were our biggest attendance of the year. Those are the evangelic, you know, that's when we do our evangelism. That's the time when most non-Christians will come back to church. And I've always argued, no, it isn't. Non-Christians aren't coming back to church on Easter, and especially not coming back on Easter. What's really happening there is all your Christian people who are only coming once or twice a month are all coming back on the same day. That's why your attendance is exploding. And I think we're seeing the same thing here. In my, again, this is anecdotal, but in my conversations with a lot of people, including in my life group, they're telling me they're loving, one thing they like, not say they're loving, one thing they like about this shutdown, and especially online services, is they don't have to just watch our church's service. I have people that bounce. I know one person who, they literally watch church all day long. They just go from service to service to service. And I wonder how many, you know, how many of these views are not even people that are in your range, that they're not non-Christians looking in. They're people from other parts of the country that are interested in listening to you, maybe former people that were part of your church before, you know? So I think
if they're watching all day, they must not have Netflix.
Yeah, I'm just a bit of
it's the new NFL. It's the Red Zone network for churches. They just jump from one to another.
I offended my wife the first week because we've actually been watching church when watching the services at Saddle. We were members there at one point, and so I don't know what that says about my church, but I took a picture of it and posted it on Facebook. I said, "Wow, church hopping has never been easier." Yeah. But I think, you know, I have to agree with you there, Doctor. Is that I have a friend that he wrote a book called Grow Your Church in 28 Days Guaranteed. And his premise of it is that the average church literally has, in order to maintain your current weekend attendance, you more or less have 5 times as many people who are a regular part of your church. So 80% attend 33 times a year, and the other 20% attend like 2 times a year. So there is, and I'm with you on Easter. I mean, I think there is that place where people invite friends and you have visitors, but by and large is the Sunday that everybody comes to church, because that's why the Sunday after Easter is down. So I think there's that dynamic in some places. I think the other thing, you know, in this that I've seen is the last time something this catastrophic took place in the United States, and I'm not going back to 1918 and the Spanish flu. The last time in recent memory we had anything that was this stressful to us was 9/11. And the Sunday after 9/11, I mean, if you weren't there early, you didn't get a seat in church.
Everybody.
And so now we have the same kind of thing, except you can't go to church. So everybody's showing up online. So the guy that's 400 that went to 800 maybe is finding a way for the people that come, you know, every now and then. I think the average in the United States now is 1.4 times a month. And so maybe they'll engage more if it's online. But then the church of 10,000 that I talked to a couple weeks ago that had 200,000 people at Easter, that's a whole different thing. And what that's kind of showing in some of those quarters, and now we're supposed to be talking about small groups, but I think what the online service is going to start to threaten are multi-sites. Because if I'm going to a location to watch a service that's online, why can't I just stay home and do that?
Yeah, that's a big, that is true. I think you're on to that for sure.
but I still go back to this idea of intentional connections, this idea of groups, even in the pandemic. I think this is the glue. Yeah. This is the glue that holds people together.
The thing is interesting about the 9/11 is that you're right. The Sunday afterwards, there were a lot of people there, and a lot of people came back. They were hurting. They were trying to understand what was going on. And the church just operated as normal. And in the weeks after 9/11, church attendance went right back down.
Oh, yeah.
It's interesting that, again, anecdotal, but, you know, I look at numbers. I look at Facebook views. The service that I attend every week I see the numbers, and every week they've been slowly sliding since Easter as far as views.
Yeah, I think there's just some of that because people go back to their regular patterns because there really is no excuse to skip church because I just have to,
right,
fire up my Roku and there it is, or turn on my computer. But I think there is a place, for community that's online and celebrating group life. I saw a thing from Barna this last week that, about half of groups are, connecting online. Some new groups have started. Some groups are just kind of waiting it out. And even in groups, I think it's shifted. Even in the coaching groups that I do, we'll spend the first half of our conversation talking about the impact on their church, how the church is serving the community, some of the things that they're doing. And it's interesting because we have a church in Washington State that they've been under quarantine for going on 2 months. And then we have a church in the middle of Nebraska that 2 months ago, there wasn't even a case. And so now that things are beginning to shift, it's interesting to see what's happening in different parts of the country, but also to kind of give people a heads up. In fact, this church in Washington, I was on a coaching call with them, and they're talking about the incidents of domestic violence and some of these things that are happening with people being, too close for too long. And so I'm helping them promote a series they're doing. It's called Cabin Fever. And we're talking about how to deal with stress, how to deal with kids at home. This week is working from home and kind of some strategies around that. And he's pulling in different experts. Now that term may be loosely because on the stress one, his expert was me. But I have been studying stress for 35 years. But it's a free download on my website. I'm not charging anything for it. But we're planning on doing a 6-week series or maybe even longer, depending on it. But just trying to give some people some tools to kind of deal with what's going on. He's going to do one on exercise, and various things to kind of keep yourself healthy in all of this. But I think it is a good opportunity. It's a good excuse to try some things you've never tried before. And I think if you've never tried online groups and you try online groups and they fail, then you could just say, well, it was an experiment. It was just for when we were quarantined. It's not, forever. But also in that, you could find some things that you could keep going. Or, what meetings do you keep at church, and which ones do you meet at? Do you do them this way? But maybe you have the meetings at 8:30 at night after everybody's kids are hopefully in bed. Yeah. And they don't have to get dressed up and go to church. If they're not wearing pants, they just need to not stand up. So, I digress. We're off of small groups at this point.
Well, just for your awareness, this class has wired to it. Our capstone assignment is that these students have to develop a small group while they're in this class, unless they've already had one. Then we ask them to work with the one they have. But every student has to gather a group of people around them, and they have to have 4 different, and I have them evaluated and such. But in this class, because of the situation, they're all doing online groups. So yeah, this class is very real in that way. In fact, I see Bruce, you have your mic off. Do you have a question or a thought?
No, I was just going to say that I think the difference though between 9/11 and this is that component of people being, after 9/11, people were shocked and scared, but it was largely because of what they saw, as the attacks on the East Coast. But someone in California didn't necessarily, yes, they went into the churches and they may have been, but this is, people were isolated and they're wanting to, so now I think more people being isolated are searching for that connection in that community. And even so, being isolated at home, they're seeing challenges that they didn't see after 9/11, but they're seeing personally hit them now. So I think, and it'll only be proven afterwards, I think there'll be a stronger connection to community in the church beyond this after this, because I think people will still want to, they'll want to remain connected, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I completely,
like 9/11.
I completely agree. And, and again, most of the excuses have been eliminated. I mean, we have new things of trying to figure out technology. And what about older people? Well, my dad's 80 years old. He's all over the internet. So, maybe 100-year-old people, I don't know. but you know, and of course kids at home, but it's like, you know what, I was at a meeting today, and it was with this team and from all over the country trying to work on a project, and my 6-year-old son wandered into the room and pokes his head out on the screen. Everybody waved hi, and then, you know, and so, you know, we worry about interruptions, but you know, if you're working in a church office, you get interrupted all the time, right? And so I found my interruptions are sometimes because somebody wants to give me a hug, or somebody has a warm cookie for me, or, you know, so my interruptions are not so bad. And so even with that, with small groups, and so I am, you know, I think the people that are first responders, people that are, you know, they're working extra long hours, people that are stocking shelves in grocery stores all night, things like that, you know, I'm going to give them a pass on small groups. But for other people, it's like, you know, this really is an opportunity, I think, to get them connected in some way and to have some sort of a check-in. And, you know, even if they have Zoom fatigue, you know, I've been on Zoom since, you know, 7 hours ago today, and I've got another 2-hour meeting after this, so I'm okay.
And maybe this is, we're getting down to the end here, but to me, any group, it's about attitudes. You know, the attitude of the person coming in, how they feel, what they feel. So many times we aim for the head when really we miss the heart component of a group. And it's why we call our groups life groups, not small groups or connect groups or home groups, because we really feel we're trying to do life together. And we want to create life. We want to create new life. We had 7 baptisms in our first year out of our life groups. So
that's fantastic. Yeah, no, and I'm with you on that. And it really is, you know, life on life. Sometimes it's a study. I mean, it doesn't have to be a meeting. I think it is the idea of having a connection. And I think there's even an ebb and flow in when do you meet for a Bible study and when do you meet to hang out or to serve together or to do something social together. One other thing I want to bring up before we end.
We'll make this the last word for you.
Okay. Is, and I don't know what other speakers have told you, I'm a big believer in coaching when you have small groups. Because there is a place, and it goes back to Jethro's advice to Moses, which is not original with me. It goes back to Carl George and is prepare your church for the future. But you have leaders of 10s, which are your small group leaders. You have leaders in 50s and 100s that are your coaches. And you have leaders of thousands that are, if you have thousands, are kind of your small group team, if you will. I've done this completely with volunteers. I was at a church, the Church of California had an average attendance of 800 on the weekend. The church, adults, and then the church here in South Carolina, the average adult attendance was about 5,000. And so this system kind of went both ways. I had no other paid staff. I had an assistant here. I had no assistant in California. So these churches with multiple staff in small groups, I can't even, you know, I don't even speak that language. But what I found was if I take leaders, that experienced leaders, and help them with new leaders. So if we open this up, we letting people do a study with their friends, people that have never led before, people that I don't really know, which was a very risky thing for me. Then how do I know they're not doing something terrible? How do I know that they're not teaching heresy? How do I know that they're not trying to sell them into multi-level marketing? You know, all these things. And so what I found was if I take a leader that I do know and I trust, and I put that leader in the life of the new leader, they can answer questions for them. They can encourage them. They can help them, and they can, you know, spy on them for me. And so it was a big day for me when I'm sitting with my coaches, because in my days where my 7 years that I only had 30% of my adults, you became a leader in my church if I knew who you were. And so I recruited you, I coached you, I trained you, and that's how you got to be a leader. And I'm sitting in this meeting with my coaches, and one of my coaches, his name's Carlos, says to me, he says, "Boy, I was talking to Rick this week." He said, "Rick is so excited about his group." He said, "Rick says this is the best thing he's ever done." And I looked at Carlos and I said, "Who's Rick?" I didn't know Rick. I'd never met Rick. I couldn't pick Rick out of a lineup. And I was so careful before. And part of it was, you know, my name is Alan. I'm a recovering control freak. Part of it was my need for control that I was keeping. You know, I thought I'm keeping this guy away from, potentially I would be keeping him away from the best thing that he's ever done because of my need to be controlling. And this was something I would plead before God. I'd say, "But God, we need quality control." And God would speak back and say, "Alan, when you say quality control, quality is your excuse." And I was like, oh. And so we opened it up. I had a lot of people leading groups in both of those churches that I had never met before, but I kept control of two things because, you know, I'm so responsible for it, right? Every new leader got a coach, which was a leader that was trained, a leader that had experience, and there was a connection with the coaches. And every new group was given curriculum that we had chosen for them or we had made for them, usually with a video, because the video did a couple of things for us. One was it got our senior pastor more interested in groups because the pastor's teaching was on the video, so obviously he wants the groups to succeed. The second thing that it did was it assured the new leader that they didn't have to be a teacher, and it assured us that the new leader wasn't teaching. Because we don't want them to teach, we want them to facilitate a discussion. Okay. And so coaching, I found, was a big part of that. I would even say, to me, coaching is more important than training, but you do a lot of the training through the coach, and you do a lot of it on the job. You do it in teachable moments. I was talking to a small group pastor, I think actually whoever was from Katy, Texas, they're from Milestone Church. And the small group pastor had spent his entire career in corporate training and then went into ministry, was doing small group ministry. He said, this is really going to sound funny coming from my background, but he said, I learned the best training is delivered by the person who's the most proximate to the leader that needs help. So it wasn't necessarily the most educated person or the most experienced person, but the person that was the most proximate, the person that was available. I think your coaches can help with that. And before we get into a tizzy about, oh no, I got to get coaches for all my leaders. When you start out, recruit some of your experienced coaches to coach your new leaders. Because your experienced coaches have been getting by without coaches. And so you don't have to worry about them so much. But you can recruit them to coach the new ones and then build it from there. You don't have to have everybody on a nice, neat org chart. So I've seen some beautiful org charts that were completely meaningless. There wasn't any coaching taking place. But I'm a big fan of coaches. I think it provides encouragement, it provides support, it provides training, provides a link to between the group and the church, and it provides a spiritual covering for that leader. And I think that that's a significant piece. It's hard work, but I think it's neglected in some circles, and I think that's a mistake.
Yeah. Alan, we appreciate your time today. We thank you for your ministry, the work that you're doing, and consulting and leading yourself with these groups and this ministry that God has called you to. You know, in fact, that last point, I was kind of thinking about some of the, you know, I think of Celebrate Recovery, for example, which is really kind of a small group ministry in its own right.
Sure.
They use sponsors. Most recovery groups use what's called a sponsor. And you can replace sponsor and coach together, you know, someone that is ahead of you in the journey that you latch onto and they help you out with various things. I could see that working really well with groups. And you're looking at a control freak too. It's very easy for me to want to have my plan, my program. But thank you very much for being here.
Oh, you're welcome.
So, wow, what a great time. So,
all right, thank you, Alan. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Alan.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Alan.